You know what's even better than magic deer powers? Magic deer powers that infinitely charge your rune. Garren Rood is usually the first new pact you get access to in Soulframe, since you get the vision from the Torment stag fable, one of your earlier story quests, and Volcane can craft it for you once you get her to bond too. Garren Rood's 3 arcanics are Torment, Behest, and Stampede, and all 3 of these have seen some changes since my last Garren Rood video. Let's start with the ability that has changed the most, Torment. This arcanic is a single target nuke that used to deal damage that scaled with your courage and gave you a full heal, but now its function is a bit more complicated. Torment still nukes your target and still has a fixed range, but the damage it deals is a percentage of that target's remaining health. That percentage scales with your courage, but the amount that Torment heals you now scales with the amount of damage you do to the enemy. This means that tormenting an enemy that only has a few HP left will only deal a small amount of damage and provide a small heal, even if you're running a high courage build. However, if your enemy has a decent chunk of health, then Torment can still do pretty decent damage and provide a great heal. Unfortunately, Torment has 2 pretty big limitations. The first is that most bosses only take a small portion of whatever Torment's normal damage would be. The other limitation is that Torment's heal is still very buggy in a group. Most of the time, it tries to heal the first person in your squad list whether they're at full health or not. It very rarely heals you, so if you're playing in co-op, make sure you don't rely on Torment as your primary source of healing. Next, let's talk about Stampede, because this arcanic has the same basic functionality it had before, but is much better. Stampede still summons a herd of stags to charge at your target, but that herd now has a much higher density, especially at the front of the charge. The stags deal excellent damage that scales with your courage and deal a good amount of stagger. They can clear a path through multiple targets or do a ton of damage to a single boss, making this a very strong ability. Finally, we have Behest. This is still an AoE CC with a range that scales with your grace and a duration that scales with your spirit, except that in both cases the scaling is now extremely weak. Fortunately, the base range and base duration are quite good, so Behest is still very useful even without grace or spirit on your build. This is a theme in all of Soulframe's packs right now. Spirit and Grace don't feel impactful outside of weapon damage scaling, leaving Courage as the only meaningful virtue for Pact Arcanics, but we're not going to worry about this too much because we already know a major virtue rework is coming. Still, I have to at least acknowledge that we are in a Courage meta in Preludes 12, and Garren Rood will give us an excellent example of how to build for that meta and how we can build for other virtues despite the meta. Let's start with the meta build. Garren Rood is the perfect pact to use with Purity and Treefell, the new Greatsword rune, and to understand why, we need to look at Garren Rood's Pact Upgrades. Righteous is supposed to reduce the cooldown of Behest, but it's bugged and doesn't work. Either way, you're better off using Akin, since that will give you cooldown reduction to all 3 of your arcanics. Healheart is the bread and butter of P12 Garren Rood. This upgrade gives you extra time with an active rune whenever you heal yourself or an ally. Since Torment is bugged in co-op, we're not really concerned with the healing allies part, but self-healing will trigger from both Guild Wars lifesteal and melee health regain. This means that when you're playing solo, you can actually skip sympathy on Garren Rood because you want to be below max health whenever possible. If you're playing in a group, then you should take a single point in sympathy so you can top yourself off periodically, but you don't want the longer heal over time from the upgrade because you'll want to proc Healheart instead. Your remaining upgrade points should go first into Mora's Pride for as much courage as you can get. Courage will make your heavy attacks with Purity hit harder and will make your Stampede do more damage. Then you should put as many points as you can into Everbound. You're going to need to constantly take hits to keep your rune up, and having a larger health pool really helps. So here are your finished upgrades for solo play, and here are your finished upgrades for co-op play. I chose to use a Greatsword on this build because to get the most out of Healheart, we are going to need a melee weapon that has been reforged with Guild War joinery, which will give that weapon a small amount of lifesteal. The high damage output of Greatsword heavy attacks means our lifesteal will actually be meaningful in combat. Polearms can also work here, but the addition of Treefell makes Greatswords the better choice overall, since this rune lets you heavy attack faster with Greatswords and hit more targets with each attack. And this gives me an excuse to talk about Greatswords in general. Greatswords are a lot of fun to play, but in my opinion, only when you build them to be fun. Greatsword animations are very slow by default, and certain portions of the attack animations cannot be cancelled with a block input. This is actually true of every melee weapon, but the length and design of Greatsword animations keep you in that uncancelable state much longer, which in turn makes blocking and parrying with a Greatsword extremely difficult compared to other melee weapons. I did some pretty extensive melee testing to create this build, so now I could probably do a whole video just about the state of Soulframe melee combat in P12, but I'll save that for after we've finished our pact builds. What matters right now is that greatswords are much more fun to play if you equip the Mercurial totem in both an attack slot and a defense slot. Speeding up the attack animations overall will mean you spend less time animation locked, and then increasing the parry window makes the game a bit more forgiving with parry timing. I wish I could make an argument for using the Highborn in your defense slot, but as we'll see when we talk about armor, it's just not worth it. If you know you're definitely not going to try to parry with your greatsword, then you should put the Thief in your defense slot instead for more physical armor. Either way, you still need the Mercurial in one of your attack slots because the greatsword animations are just way too slow otherwise. On this build, we're mostly going to spam heavy attacks, so your other attack totem should be the Bulwark. Quick side note here, if you don't have Treefell and want to run this build with Everflame, then equip the Stomping instead of the Bulwark and spam light attacks instead of heavy attacks. It still works quite well. Your greatsword combat arts are largely up to preference. Once again, we're mostly spamming heavy attacks on our Treefell build, so all you really need is the smite chance from Smitten. Use Preludes as your sidearm with a messenger in utility for smite, the clever and the ambling in defense for armor, and the tireless in attack for armor strip. You can equip either Whirlwind or Pictrix to get the extra defense slot. It doesn't matter too much for our Treefell build because we're just going to use Orbit to proc smite and strip armor, but if you do like using Pictrix, Garren Rood makes it much more fun, as we'll see later on. For Flyblade combat arts, the most important nodes are Smitten and Twist of Luck. Anything after that is up to preference. The ideal talisman on this build is Molten Mora, but you can also use Koga Lorkhan or Synod's Beljar. Finally, let's talk armor. In theory, this build should be great with a ton of stability. You want to be constantly taking damage and healing, so you should be better off favoring stability to tank hits without being knocked down. Unfortunately, stability just doesn't do much in Soulframe. Enemy attacks can fully stagger you out of animations even when they haven't broken your stability bar, and raising your stability rating does not affect this. I strongly dislike this mechanic and hope it changes in the future, because what is the point of a stability rating if we can't build for stability to tank hits while we fight? Even when I tested using the highest stability rating you can currently get, I was still getting knocked down in 2 hits, and sometimes in 1. This all seems pretty silly to me. I love the idea of using stability armor to support a health tanking build, but the stagger system we currently have is just not balanced in a way to make that possible. Instead, you're better off maximizing armor and taking a bit less damage. So, for our Garren Rood build with Purity and Treefell, we're going to use Orengal's Cuirass, Mockery du Throw, and the Arbearer's Mask, because this gives us the best combination of both magical and physical armor, with a slight emphasis on physical. You will still be vulnerable to stagger, by which I mean both the way attacks jostle your character and the stagger mechanic that knocks you prone when your stability bar breaks, so if you're surrounded by several enemies you will want to use Behest to manage aggro and reposition. The duration of Behest does get a lot shorter on bosses, but it can still help you deal with aggro from adds or keep a boss in place while you cast Stampede. Overall, this build is pretty solid. Proc smite with your Flyblades, pull smite while you have Purity out, and then spam heavy attacks until everything is dead. Try to take a hit every now and then and keep your health below full. This will allow the healing from your Gildor and your melee regain to keep your rune going almost indefinitely. While the melee regain healing means you don't technically need Gildor, I do find it makes the build much more comfortable. That extra bit of healing does help, and if you can't run to the next enemy in time to save your rune, you can always throw your greatsword at them. Save your Torment for when your health gets below half, and make sure to use it on targets that have enough health to give you a good heal. Torment is still useful in boss fights, but only for refreshing your rune charge when a boss is out of range for a melee attack. How much rune charge you get from Healheart is determined by the amount of points you have in the upgrade, not how much you heal, so even a tiny heal can still get you a lot of charge. You can use Healheart to recharge your Greatsword rune with your Flyblades, or your Flyblades rune with your Greatsword, but only if you only have one rune active. If both runes are active at once, Healheart will always prioritize your main weapon rune. That said, if you do like swapping to your Flyblades, Healheart will make Pictrix last a lot longer when it activates. This is our new Flyblade rune, and its main downside is the extremely short duration. That is just not an issue when you're using Garren Rood and Flyblades reforged with Gildor. In fact, every rune is just better on Garren Rood with a Gildor weapon, with the sole exception of Flitsmoke because you can't heal if you're at max health, and Flitsmoke's invisibility makes it fairly difficult to take damage. It's still possible, but there are more efficient ways to build for Flitsmoke. On a Gildor shield, Durglint's blocking dot will heal you, making it extremely easy to keep this rune up constantly. Unfortunately, most enemies in Koga have too much armor for tick damage to matter, so 4-burn is still probably a better option for shields until we get some changes to how armor works. Healheart makes it very easy to keep the hollowing up until you've marked every enemy on a battlefield, making it possible to clear an entire fight with one kill since enemies explode when they die, and you don't need to courage attune a magic weapon to do this. Garren Rood is still good on off-meta builds, by which I mean non-courage builds. Yes, courage is just better in Preludes 12, but that still doesn't mean you can't run other virtues. The Treefell Greatsword build works just fine on a full Grace Garren Rood with Needle's Eye, even in Koga, and a Spirit Garren Rood can absolutely destroy enemies with Archstorm. Even Alka's Breath and Torrent are good on Garren Rood. Torrent has some interesting functionality that makes it pretty broken at the moment, which we'll definitely get into in another video, but what's relevant right now is that you can basically keep bow runes up constantly because the otherwise disappointing amount of lifesteal from Gildor is actually perfect for healing you just enough for rune charge, but not so much that you get to full health. So, as much as melee combat's health regain mechanic is absolutely perfect for charging runes with Healheart and Garren Rood, I'll still be using bow builds. Surprising to no one, I'm sure. If you enjoyed this video, please help it out with a like and subscribe if you want to see more updated Pact builds. I know I said my P12 build guides would be shorter videos, but the Pact changes and new runes introduced with Thaw-Tide were just too interesting for me to gloss over, and this has been a lot of fun to make. But what do you think? Do you still want to see a streamlined summary of P12 Pact builds, or do you want the juicy details on all the packs? Let me know in the comments, and until next time, happy hunting!